All right, everyone. It's 11 a.m. Let's get started. So we're going to start off by quickly finishing Chapter 8, which is, again, the zoomed-out account of this unit, and then we'll start going through the readings. I'm hoping today to finish the first two Greene readings, where he lays out his dual process model in some detail. There'll be a little bit of overlap between the two readings, but it should give you a good sense of what he thinks. Okay, so just a few things left in the book. So Valerie Tiberius distinguishes two different accounts of what's going on with reflective equilibrium. I wouldn't worry too much about these terms, but you may see them in the literature. And those are intuitionism and constructivism. So intuitionism in this case, is a type of moral realism. And it's a type that says that our intuitions have some connection with moral truth, especially the ones we hold most firmly. So remember that in reflective equilibrium, we start with our intuitions and then try to posit principles that explain them. If you hold to intuitionism, you think that at least some of those intuitions track objective moral truth. So this would be an example of a view that Sharon Street would argue against. Whereas constructivism is a type of moral anti-realism, where these principles we put forward to explain our intuitions, we're kind of just making them up, we're constructing them, and there's no mind-independent truth to which they correspond. So I'll tell you right now, those terms will not be on the test, but if you want to read through the chapter, that should help you stay clear. The chapter then discusses how Judith Jarvis Thomson actually changed her mind over the years about the conflict between the switch case and the footbridge case. Don't worry about the details, but there's an interesting discussion of that in the book. Something else that the book discusses that, again, I wouldn't worry too much about, but it's a very good thing to know. It's one of the most famous ideas in ethics. This comes from John Rawls, who's the same guy who put forward the idea of reflective equilibrium. So Rawls wrote probably the most influential book in ethics in the latter half of the 20th century. It was about justice. And one of the ideas he put forward in that book is the idea of the veil of ignorance. So we have to decide on some moral rules. How do we choose which rules to adopt? According to Rawls, we should do the following. We should imagine ourselves behind a veil of ignorance. Veil of ignorance meaning we don't know who we'll be in society. We don't know how rich our parents will be, what race we'll be, etc. And then we should negotiate what the rules will be. Again, without thinking, oh, I'll rig it for the white guys because I'm a white guy. You want to invent rules that are good regardless of what situation you happen to be born into. I'll mention as an aside, I thought of including this study, but I think there's enough readings in this unit. Do you guys agree? Do you think there's enough readings in Unit 3? Yeah, okay. So there is a reading that found that if you tell people to use veil of ignorance type reasoning, it tends to lead to utilitarian judgments in moral laws. So if you're interested, you can look into that. Could be a good paper topic, but I'm not going to say anything more about that. The chapter concludes by saying that in the standard papers, including Greene's papers, you could criticize the authors for adopting a kind of simplistic account of what utilitarianism and deontology imply. There are more sophisticated versions of each that may lead to different answers to the trolley-type dilemmas. So one distinction I've already made that could be relevant is the distinction between act and rule utilitarianism. So, act utilitarianism says you should bring utilitarian considerations to bear when deciding which particular action to do. So, should I kill this guy and take his organs and save 5 lives? Well, 5 is more than 1, so using utilitarian considerations, I should conclude yes, that's a good thing to do. Whereas rule utilitarianism says you don't bring happiness and suffering to bear on particular decisions. You only bring it to bear when deciding which rules to follow. So, and then you just, when faced with a particular dilemma, you don't appeal to utilitarianism, you appeal to the rules that you've decided on. The rules that, in general, will promote more happiness than suffering. So, if doctors killed patients every time they thought they could get their organs, the world would be a worse place in terms of suffering. So we're going to make the rule, don't kill your patients to get their organs. And then when faced with that decision, you appeal to the rule, not to utilitarian considerations. And there are also nuanced versions of Kantian ethics or deontology that may say it's okay in some cases to sacrifice one to save many. So that's all I have to say about the chapter. So now we're going to look at the 2 Greene readings. Oh, sorry. Yep.
Can you go over act utilitarianism once?
Yeah, for sure. So think again of the doctor case. So act meaning like action. So for every specific action, you decide what to do based on what will produce the most happiness or the least suffering. So utilitarianism review means do whatever maximizes the greatest happiness or the greatest number. If you're an act utilitarian, you bring those considerations to bear when making that specific decision. Rule utilitarians say, and someone asked about this after class, part of the problem with act utilitarianism is it's very hard to know in particular cases, how much happiness or suffering will be produced. So what rule utilitarians say is, don't think about whether your specific actions promote happiness or suffering. Think about which rules will, in general, produce more happiness or suffering. So the rule, don't kill your patients to get their organs, is a good rule to follow. If doctors follow that, we'll all be better off in terms of happiness versus suffering. So we should adopt that rule, and then when you're making a decision, you appeal to the rule to make a decision. Any other questions before we start the Greene reading? So the first reading has a really nice title. It's a line from Nietzsche, The Secret Joke of Kant's Soul. So here's what Nietzsche says. I'll read the quote directly. Kant wanted to prove, in a way that would dumbfound the common man, and what he's referring to there is, if you've ever taken a philosophy class and had to read passages from Kant, very hard to read. Apparently it's even hard to read in the German. He used a lot of jargon, and then translated to English, and it's very, very hard work. I don't think it's like some philosophers where it just is a bunch of nonsense. I think if you work through it, there is something there. But it's very difficult to work through. But a lot of the views he defended were kind of common sense type views, even though he defended them in this very sophisticated way. So back to the Nietzsche quote, Kant wanted to prove, in a way that would dumbfound the common man, that the common man was right. That was the secret joke of his soul. He wrote against the scholars in support of popular prejudice, but for scholars and not for the people. So the idea there is, he's defending common sense views, but in this kind of sophisticated way. Kant is engaging in what psychologists would call rationalization. Now, a kind of funny, but kind of crude example that Greene starts with is a direct quote from Kant, where he argues that masturbation is morally wrong because it involves using yourself as a means to an end. So Kant thought it was wrong to use people as a means to an end, and Kant said this includes using oneself as a means to an end. So that feels like quite a stretch. So what he's doing here, according to Nietzsche and Greene too, is he's writing in the 1700s. It's a very common thought back then. This is just sort of impure and disgusting. So Kant tries to think of a reason why this is immoral, and this is what he arrives at, a kind of goofy argument. As an aside, when I was defending my dissertation, I was doing it over Zoom, so 5 professors were asking me questions about my dissertation, and someone asked if Kant thought that it was wrong to use oneself as a means, and this was the only example I could think of. And I put it in a euphemism, like, oh, it's wrong to do a certain sex act, which involves using yourself as a means. I forgot that my mother was outside the room listening to it, so that's too bad. But anyway, so that's an example of what Nietzsche is talking about. So Greene starts off by talking about Haidt, who we've already seen. So remember, Haidt's view is that moral judgment in general is driven by intuition or emotion, and reasoning is largely post hoc. It's there to defend the intuitions that you already have. And one way of summarizing Greene's view is that's true, but more so for deontological type intuitions. There are at least some cases where reasoning can override our intuitions. So this is review, but as far as what deontology is, deontological theories emphasize things like rights and duties that are thought to be inviolable. You can't violate them. Whereas consequentialism as a family of theories is the view that what determines the rightness or wrongness of an action is the consequences. Now, I'll make a point up front. I've already said this back in Unit 1, but in different papers, Greene uses different terms, but just to be clear, so consequentialism is a family of views that says it's the effects or consequences of an action that make it right or wrong. And by far the most talked about version is utilitarianism. You won't have to worry about distinguishing them in the test, but I may sometimes use them interchangeably. Technically they're distinct, but that's the relationship between them. Utilitarianism meaning, as I said earlier, the only consequences that matter are happiness and suffering. So the strategy of, yes?
Sorry, could you just repeat your summary of Greene's perspective?
So one way of summarizing it, and we'll see lots of detail later, is that Haidt is right that intuitions drive moral judgment and that reasoning is a rationalization, but that's only true or more true of deontological judgments.
Okay.
So one feature of Greene's view, or I guess I should say a conjecture that he makes, is that, so there's long history of debate between consequentialists and deontologists, and what Greene says is the reason these two views have gotten so much traction is that they relate to two distinct psychological processes, or what he calls psychological natural kinds. These are two types of thinking that are dissociable and that are sort of in our cognitive repertoire. Really nice sentence. According to this view, the moral philosophies of Kant, Mill, and others, Kant being a deontologist, Mill being a utilitarian, so those philosophies are just the explicit tips of large, mostly implicit psychological icebergs. even though they may not be explicitly defined that way. And he has a nice analogy. Suppose you find an ancient tribe that defines water as a clear, drinkable liquid. So in their version of the dictionary, or the oral tradition of what the term means, that's how they define water. And then you bring along an ice cube and say, this is whatever your word is for water. And they say, no, look at the definition. It means clear, drinkable liquid. And in a certain sense, you'd be right. I mean, however, if you can define a term however you want. If that's what you mean by water, then this is not water. But the term you use to refer to water is referring to something that in fact is the same thing as the ice cube. So even though we have these terms, utilitarianism, deontology, that refer to explicitly defined philosophies, Greene's contention is what we're actually pointing at is these distinct psychological processes. So, but in psychology, we have to operationalize things. We have to give operational definitions. So he defines what he calls characteristically deontological judgments and characteristically consequentialist or utilitarian judgments. And this is going to be relevant to some of the critics like Kahan. He's not saying that people who make these judgments are utilitarians or deontologists. The way he defines a deontological judgment is it's a judgment that is easier to justify in deontological terms. So, for example, if someone says, don't push someone in front of the trolley, you could imagine a utilitarian saying that, maybe a rule utilitarian or something. But it's the kind of moral judgment that is easier to explain or justify in deontological terms, right? You say something like, Kant says, don't use someone as a means to an end. In this case, using them as a trolley stopper. And similarly, a characteristically consequentialist or utilitarian judgment is one that is easier to justify in consequentialist or utilitarian terms. Okay, any questions so far? So, oh, yeah.
So the characteristically deontological, would you say, is more like reliant on realism?
Realism isn't relevant, so I suspect deontologists would be more likely to be realists, but no, it's, as we're going to see next, is his conjecture is it's more associated with emotion or intuition.
Okay.
So then we have to give, there's going to be different terms in the papers for this, but in this paper he talks about the distinction between cognition and emotion, so similar to the System 2, System 1 distinction. These are, of course, difficult to define. So there's a few things that distinguish them. One is flexibility versus stereotyped or fixed. So cognitive type thinking is more flexible, whereas emotional thinking is more fixed and stereotyped. Whether it's fixed by the genes or by habit, it's less flexible. Additionally, emotional type thinking is behaviorally valenced, meaning it tends you towards doing one particular thing. So if you feel angry, it inclines you to lashing out or harming someone. Whereas cognitive mental states are more behaviorally neutral. You're processing something, thinking through different things, but it's not the type of thinking that automatically triggers particular behaviors. Does that make sense? Okay. What's the neural basis? There's a couple of different brain regions that are thought to be implicated. Let me see if this looks okay. That's good enough. So, one thing I'm sure all of you know is the limbic system. So, the part underneath the cortex, so places like the amygdala, hypothalamus, those are associated with emotional responses. One part of the frontal lobe that seems to also be associated with emotional responses is the VMPFC. So, ventral, meaning like you imagine like you're a sheep and your head's like this, so the underside of the frontal lobe in that sense, and medial, meaning in the middle. That is, as I said in the previous class, involved in kind of attaching value to different behavioral choices. And conveniently, now the brain isn't always nice to us in making it easy to understand, but in this case, as you can see, it's a region that's closely connected with the limbic system. So it kind of receives the emotional inputs from the limbic system, if you want to put it kind of loosely, and then attaches value to different decisions that you can make. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, so dorsal meaning like top, if you imagine you're a sheep with your head like this, and lateral meaning outside. So it's sort of the furthest part away from the limbic system, if you want to think about it that way. This is more involved in controlled cognition, careful conscious reasoning, or what dual process theorists would call system 2. Obviously, this is an oversimplification. The details are going to be complicated, but that's a good first approximation. If you want a silly way to remember which is which, because we'll be talking about these two brain regions a lot, VMPFC, value, DLPFC, D, deliberation. There you go. Merry Christmas. So, now let's move from there. So, Greene has conjectured that, oh, yeah.
Could you repeat the last thing you said?
The memory trick?
Yeah.
Yeah, so VMPFC, V, value, that's the more emotional one. DLPFC, D, deliberation.
Okay.
So we then have 4 empirical possibilities, as Greene says. So he's conjectured that there are these 2 different types of moral judgment, consequentialist, deontological, and 2 types of psychological processes, cognitive and emotional. So we have 4 different possibilities. One is that both types of moral judgment are caused by cognition, generally speaking. So if you're a moral rationalist, you're probably going to think that. If you want to kind of oversimplify Kohlberg, you could classify him this way. He thought that 2 of the most mature types of moral thinking are more, one is more deontological, one's more utilitarian, but for him, we reason our way to these judgments. If you're Haidt, both kinds of judgments are going to be based on emotion, because for Haidt, basically all moral judgment starts off as emotional. One conjecture that would be kind of the opposite of what Greene's going to say is you could imagine it turning out to be the case that utilitarians, or utilitarian judgment I should say, is more based on emotion and deontological judgment is more based on reason. Wouldn't be totally crazy. So I mean, if you read Kant, Kant is a rationalist. He writes very sophisticated way, whereas a lot of the utilitarians come out of the sentimentalist tradition and from guys like Hume were very important influences on utilitarians. So you could imagine it turning out that utilitarian judgments are based more on reason. Sorry, utilitarian judgments based more on emotion, and deontological judgment based more on reason. But of course, as I've already said, Greene is going to argue for the 4th possibility, which is that reason and cognition tends to cause utilitarian judgments, and emotion tends to cause deontological judgments. So those are the 4 possibilities. He is going to argue for the 4th one. Sorry if I mixed up words. Any questions about that? You do?
Yeah.
Although I won't test you on the 4 possibilities, but just very quickly. So either reason causes both kinds, emotion causes both kinds, or reason causes one and emotion causes the other. Yeah. And in case I mixed up any words, the one that Greene is going to argue for is reason causes utilitarian judgments, emotion causes deontological judgments. So if it confuses you to remember what I said about the third possibility, don't worry about it. Crucially, before making his case for what he thinks is right, this is something that came up actually in my defense too. Someone asked me about this. Greene does not think, certainly in the moral sphere, that there is such a thing as emotion-free thinking. So when he says that utilitarian judgments are caused by reason, he doesn't mean that you can reach utilitarian conclusions without any emotion at all. So as he says, he is sympathetic to Hume's claim that all moral judgment must have some emotional component. So, to make that explicit, even if you're a utilitarian and very cognitive and rational, you still have to care about happiness and suffering. And care is, for Greene and Hume, an emotional term. Right? If you don't care at all, utilitarianism can't get off the ground. Another distinction that's important is the distinction between, and this will come up in the neuroscience paper, we might get to it today or might have to wait till the next class, but the distinction between personal moral dilemmas and impersonal ones. Specifically, sacrificial type dilemmas. So personal dilemmas would be like the footbridge case, where you have to lay hands on someone and harm or kill them directly. Another example is, you're in a basement with other people hiding out from soldiers who want to kill you. There's a crying baby, and the only way to make him stop crying is to kind of suffocate him and pretend you know for sure that's the only way. Is it acceptable to kill the baby to save the other lives? And if you're utilitarian, you should say yes, at least to a first approximation. So there's lots of examples like this that have been used in the literature. Those would be examples of personal moral dilemmas. Whereas impersonal ones would be like the switch case, right? Where you're not harming someone with your hands, you're pulling a switch or doing something without directly harming them up close. So one simple finding that's not especially surprising, but for whatever it's worth, in the personal dilemmas, you do find more activity in the emotion centers of the brain. Whereas in the impersonal dilemmas, you find more activity in places like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So when you're just thinking, is 5 more than 1, I'm just pulling a switch, you're kind of thinking through it in a more reasoned cognitive way. But if you're thinking about shoving someone in front of a trolley, that just feels wrong. More amygdala and activity in regions like that. So Greene has a nice picture in his book about this, if you want to remember. So in the impersonal ones, like the switch case, system 1, like emotional type thinking, not very strongly activated. System 2 takes over and it leads to the judgment, yes, this is good. But for most people in the, footbridge case, there's a much stronger emotional reaction, and this leads to you saying, no, it's wrong. We'll see in the next paper that you can also look at individual differences. So looking just at the footbridge case, or personal type dilemmas, some people are more reflective, so they have a stronger system 2, and they are going to be more likely to say, yes, it's okay to do it. Whereas people who rely more on intuition, and there's different ways of measuring that, are more likely to say, no, it's wrong. Just everything I said there makes sense. So the idea here is these are two types of people. So, the more reflective people and the more intuitive people. Yes?
And then how are you to decide who is more reflective?
Yeah, good. So this is kind of a teaser. So one simple way is you can give people cognitive tests like the cognitive reflection test, which is separable from IQ or cognitive ability. It involves giving people like kind of math type problems where there's an answer that pops into your head. How many of you have heard like the bat and ball question? A few of you. So I'll give that example since you asked. I'm just going to give it later, but give you an idea. I can just say it. So there's a baseball bat and a ball. Together they cost $1.10. The bat is $1 more than the ball. How much is the ball? So there should be an answer that pops into your head. Without committing to that it's right, what's the answer that pops into your head? 10 cents. So that's what pops into your head. But then you stop and think about it, you're like, well, that means it would be $1.20 total. This was $1 more than 10 cents. It's $1.10, $1.10 plus 10 cents is $1.20. Oh, okay, it's 5 cents. So you give people questions like that where there's an intuitive answer that pops into your head and a correct answer that requires reflection. And again, it's not just about ability. Most of them are ones that people can solve. It's just, are you willing to reflect on the answer that pops into your head and correct it? People who score higher on tests like that are more likely to make utilitarian judgments, at least in some studies. So that would be an example.
And so that would mean they're more reflective.
Yes, that's the idea. So now there's debate about how to interpret this pattern, but the standard way of interpreting that test is it's a measure of cognitive reflection, how much people rely on reflection. The next section is, I'm going to go through it more quickly. We'll talk a lot about this in kind of the second half of the unit, but Greene spells out a connection between emotion and the sense of moral obligation. So in this case, emotion is, or relying on just emotion makes people less utilitarian in the context of self-sacrifice, kind of giving to other people. So a paper we're actually going to see later is by Peter Singer, and just very quickly, he gives this thought experiment where suppose you're walking to work and you have a very expensive suit on, and there's a child drowning in a shallow pond, and there's not enough time to take your clothes off, so the only way to save the child is run into the dirty pond, ruin your suit, and save the child. I won't ask for a show of hands, but presumably almost everyone's going to say, yes, you have a moral duty to lose the $500 suit and save the life. And so that's an emotional response, right? It just feels like, yes, you have a duty to do that. But then Peter Singer, being the philosopher he is, says, aha, but if you donate not all that much money to the Against Malaria Foundation or something, you could also save a child's life, like in Africa or something, but you spend money on stupid shit here. So why the inconsistency? So in that case, if we relied more on cold reasoning, we'd be more utilitarian, but when we rely just on emotion to decide whether we have a duty to give, we make unutilitarian decisions. We'll talk more about that in a later section. He also talks about specifically the emotion of anger and different responses to punishment. So classic debate is, should we punish purely for consequentialist or utilitarian reasons, or should we punish because, damn it, they deserve to suffer? So utilitarians have classically appealed to three different things to justify punishment. Deterrence, so you put the murderer in jail, you scare the other would-be murderers from murdering because they know they're going to go to prison. Incapacitation, so if the murderer's in jail, he's not going to be out murdering more people. And rehabilitation, right? If you can successfully change the person, and when he's released, he'll stop his murdering ways. Not necessarily all three, but those are three that can be appealed to, because those are all in terms of consequences, right? It makes the world a better place in terms of happiness and suffering. Whereas people like Kant have standardly said that no, the primary justification for punishment is retribution. That guy's a rotten son of a gun and he deserves to suffer. We're balancing the scales of justice if we make sure that he suffers. And that latter, more retributive type response, Greene argues is based on anger, that that's what causes it. And you indeed find a strong, very strong correlation between how outrageous someone finds an action to be, meaning how angry it makes you, and how much you think you should make him suffer. So, actually, the correlation was 0.98. So, in psychology, you never see that. That's basically 1. We're happy with 0.4 half the time, right? 0.98 is pretty damn good. And there are neuroimaging studies to back that up. The desire to punish is correlated with kind of emotion center, activity and emotion centers of the brain. Yep.
Is the correlation that high? Does it get to a place where you're basically, like the definitions basically converge maybe? Like if it's almost a 1-to-1.
Yeah, some psychologists would be uncomfortable with that. They'd say that definition is prior to or separate from how much they correlate. But yeah, I mean, that's a move some people would make. Yeah, these, or the way I'd be inclined to say is these are basically measuring the same thing if they're that high. Another case where Greene thinks that emotion leads to unutilitarian decisions is disgust and the condemnation of morally harmless actions. This is somewhat related to the height reading. Some of these, I don't know who thought of these, like someone has too much time on their hands. Well, I guess philosophers by definition have too much time on their hands. So, you know, one of them is like a brother and sister do something they shouldn't do. One of them is, again, too much time on their hands. A man masturbates using a dead chicken before cooking and eating it.
Oh
So, so, and then you ask, is this morally wrong, right? And if you're a utilitarian, in a way you have to say no, right? He's not hurting anybody, you know, it's just what he's into.
Except the chicken.
Well, the chicken's already dead.
Yeah.
I mean, you can definitely make a utilitarian case against eating meat, I guess. But, okay, well, leave that aside. In any case, the other stuff. So, like, another one is use the flag of your country to clean the bathroom. And, again, if you're utilitarian, nothing wrong with that. But for some people, that's just going to be no. That's just intrinsically wrong. And Greene argues that our reactions to these kinds of things are emotional, and that if you're a utilitarian, you're going to say that no, these are not. So we'll see a more detailed set of studies showing that there's a connection between slow, careful reasoning and utilitarian judgment in the next Greene reading. So he lists a number of studies. I'll say, by the way, if you want to write your paper on something in this area, the Greene 2015 reading is a great source. It has a list of study results, so that might be helpful. But I'll close off this reading. With a kind of funny little analogy he gives. So in the last section, he talks about the potential implications of this work. So again, Greene's view, which we haven't looked at all the evidence yet, but the conclusion of it is when people appeal to reasons to defend a deontological judgment, they're doing what Haidt says most people do. They're just rationalizing. They think it's wrong to push someone in front of the trolley because of an emotional response, but then they say, oh, it's wrong because you're using someone as a mere means, or using them as a trolley stopper. But Greene's going to maintain that's a rationalization, and he gives a kind of funny analogy. So he says, suppose there's someone named Alice, and Alice has a number of different boyfriends, and when you ask Alice, oh, why did you date so-and-so? It's, oh, he had a really, really charming, really good sense of humor. And then the next guy, it's, oh, very dreamy eyes. But then they're all over 6'4", as it turns out. So it looks like all these other things were rationalizations. So I sense a little bit of repressed teenage frustration in this example. Greene is a nerd. So I sense a little bit of that. As I've given some thought to an alternative career. I don't know, you guys might be too young to remember, but do you remember the It Gets Better series? It was in the mid-2000s. It was something that LGBT people would make. They'd say, hey, your family doesn't accept your lifestyle or what you're into, but it gets better. Just come out. It'll get better as you get older. I've thought about starting a program like that, but for straight nerds, just to say to guys, hey, it gets better. Maybe Greene and I can work together on. Anyway, so that's an example of what Greene thinks deontologists are doing. So, like Alice, who says, oh, it's his charm and sense of humor, actually it's because the guy's 6'4". When deontologists say it's because of you're using someone as a means to an end, in fact, it's because of your emotional response. Okay, that's all I have to say about the first Greene reading. Any questions about that? Yes.
Sorry, you went over two terms that I'm a little confused about. Emotion and the sense of moral obligation to give is essentially relying on emotion leads to unutilitarian decisions?
Yes.
Okay, so you're less likely to self-sacrifice.
In the case of when the people are far away, you're more likely to only give when they're up close and personal. But if you were a utilitarian, you would give whenever it maximizes the greatest happiness for the greatest number.
And then the next one was the emotion, anger, and the deontological and retributive punishment. What to take out of that?
Yeah, so the utilitarian approach to punishment says you should punish only insofar as it does things like deters others from committing crimes, or incapacitates them, or rehabilitates them. Whereas a deontologist says, no, you should do it because they deserve to suffer. And even though Kant has a rich philosophical theory about why retribution makes sense, Greene maintains, no, it's just from anger. You just feel angry about it. It's drummed into us by evolution, this kind of retributive impulse, and that's what causes people to think of punishment in that way. Any other questions about the first Greene reading? Okay, so as I said, the next Greene reading, I think has more going for it. It has more studies it talks about, and also explicitly addresses the concern that Greene's argument constitutes a violation of the is-ought gap, and he, I think, has a very thoughtful discussion of that. So he starts off with a distinction between, so again, as I said before, there's different terms for this distinction. The one he focuses on in this paper is automatic mode versus manual mode. This is based on an analogy with cameras. And In fact, I have a video of Greene himself talking about this. This will be a nice bridge. Oh, it's already 11:45. Oh, it took longer than I thought. Okay, I'll save the video for next class. It's like 6 minutes. So we'll stop there.